Tonight, we travel into the Qing Dynasty, the final imperial dynasty of China, a vast empire that endured for nearly 3 centuries and stretched across mountains, rivers, and distant frontiers that most would never see in a lifetime. At its height, it appeared stable, carefully ordered, and almost unchanging, as if the system that held it together had found a way to resist time itself. And for many who lived within it, life moved in familiar rhythms shaped by the land, the seasons, and quiet expectations that rarely seemed to shift. But over time, something began to change. Not suddenly, and not in a way that could be easily seen, but gradually, within the very structure that once gave the empire its strength. And in the years that followed, those small and almost invisible changes would begin to shape the path toward its end. In the early years of the Qing Dynasty, China was already one of the largest and most structured empires in the world, governed from the imperial court in Beijing and extending across vast landscapes that connected distant regions into a single, complex system. For most people, however, life unfolded far from the center of power, shaped instead by the land beneath their feet, the changing seasons and routines that had been repeated across generations without much interruption. In the mornings, a light mist often settled over the fields, softening the edges of the world as farmers moved along familiar paths, tending crops that had supported their families for years, rarely thinking about the distant officials who recorded, taxed, and organized their lives. And yet, that system was always present, quietly maintaining order, linking villages to provinces, and provinces to the imperial center in ways that were not always visible, but always felt. For a long time, this balance held, not perfectly, but steadily, as if the empire itself had settled into a rhythm that could continue without end. But even within this sense of stability, there were signs, small and easily overlooked, where effort increased, delays appeared, and the system required just a little more than it once had. No one could fully see it yet, but something had already begun to shift, not at the center where power was most visible, but at the edges, where change often begins quietly. And in the years that followed, those subtle shifts would begin to shape everything that came next. In the years before the Qing Dynasty rose to power, the lands beyond the northeastern borders of China were shaped less by fixed boundaries and more by movement, where forests, rivers, and open plains defined a way of life that followed the rhythms of the natural world rather than the structure of an empire. This region, known broadly as Manchuria, lay beyond the Great Wall, often described from the perspective of the South as distant and unfamiliar. Yet, for those who lived there, it was a complete and self-contained world, where survival depended not on distant authority, but on the land itself. Winters arrived early and lingered, stretching across long months of cold stillness, where the ground hardened and travel slowed, and where communities turned inward, gathering around shared spaces that offered warmth, protection, and continuity. Inside these homes, built for endurance rather than display, families moved through familiar routines, tending fires, preparing food, and preserving what they could for the weeks ahead, while outside, the landscape rested under a quiet, unbroken layer of snow. For now, this rhythm was enough. When the seasons shifted, however, the land softened and movement returned, bringing with it a different pace of life, where paths reopened, trade resumed, and the connections between settlements became visible once more. Within this environment, the Yurkin people lived in organized communities, their daily lives shaped by hunting, farming, and seasonal adaptation, where skill and cooperation mattered more than hierarchy, and where leadership was earned through experience rather than inherited through distant institutions. At this time, these communities did not see themselves as part of any empire, and yet the conditions that would one day shape one were already quietly forming. Villages remained small, often separated by forests or rivers, but they were not isolated, as trade routes, though modest, allowed goods and knowledge to pass between groups, creating a network of relationships that extended further than any single settlement. These exchanges were not always formal, nor were they controlled by any central authority, but over time they built familiarity, trust, and a gradual awareness of a wider world beyond immediate surroundings. And beyond that wider world lay the Ming Dynasty, a vast and structured empire that governed from the south, representing both distance and influence, a presence that could be felt even when it was not directly seen. For some, the Ming court offered opportunities for exchange, where tribute and trade created moments of connection, while for others, it remained a distant and abstract force, known more through stories than through direct experience. This relationship was never fixed. It shifted, quietly, as conditions changed on both sides of the frontier, where cooperation could give way to tension, and where independence was constantly balanced against influence. At first, these changes were subtle, easy to overlook. Life continued as it always had, shaped by the land, the seasons, and the immediate needs of each community, where families worked, traveled, and adapted without any clear sense that something larger was beginning to take form. But over time, small adjustments began to accumulate. Leaders formed stronger alliances. Groups that had once acted independently began to coordinate more closely, and decisions that had once been local began to carry wider consequences. It was not yet unity, but it was no longer separation. In this gradual shift, certain individuals began to stand out, not simply because of strength, but because of their ability to see beyond the present, to understand both the traditions of their own people and the structures of power that existed beyond the frontier. And among them, one leader would soon begin to see possibilities that others had not yet considered. For now, however, the land remained unchanged. The forests stood as they always had. The rivers continued their steady flow. And the communities of the north moved through their days within a world that still felt familiar, even as the foundations of something new were quietly being laid. No one could fully see it yet, but the balance was beginning to shift. And in the years that followed, from this quiet frontier, a new force would begin to emerge. In the later years of the 16th century, as the Ming Dynasty still governed from the south and the northern frontier remained a landscape of scattered alliances, a new figure began to emerge among the Yurshan people, one whose influence would gradually extend beyond the boundaries of his own community. His name was Nurhaci. At first, his position was not unlike that of other local leaders, responsible for guiding his people through the challenges of survival, negotiation, and occasional conflict within a world where authority was measured less by formal titles and more by the ability to maintain stability. But the conditions around him were beginning to change. Relations between Yurshan groups were shifting, shaped by competition, cooperation, and the growing awareness that unity could offer advantages that independence could not. For many years, these groups had remained divided, their identities tied closely to lineage and territory, with alliances forming and dissolving as circumstances required, without any lasting structure to bind them together. Nurhaci, however, began to see this differently. He understood that the patterns of the past, while familiar, limited what could be achieved, and that a more stable and coordinated system might allow his people to move beyond the uncertainties of constant fragmentation. At first, his efforts were cautious. He did not attempt to impose sudden change, nor did he seek immediate control over distant groups, but instead focused on strengthening his own position, building trust, and forming alliances that could endure beyond a single moment. These alliances were not only political, but personal, reinforced through shared goals, mutual support, and the gradual alignment of interests that made cooperation more sustainable over time. And as these relationships expanded, so too did his influence. What had once been a local leadership role began to take on a broader significance, as more groups came to recognize the stability that his approach could offer, particularly in a landscape where uncertainty had long been the norm. It was not yet a unified system, but it was moving in that direction. At the same time, Nurhaci observed the structures of the Ming Dynasty to the south, not as a distant abstraction, but as a functioning model of organized power, one that demonstrated how authority could be extended across large territories through administration, hierarchy, and control. He did not seek to replicate it entirely, but he began to adapt certain ideas. Gradually, he introduced a more structured way of organizing his people, one that balanced traditional loyalties with new forms of coordination, allowing different groups to function as part of a larger whole without losing their individual identities. This would later become known as the Eight Banners system. At its core, it was not simply a military arrangement, but a social and administrative structure that organized communities into distinct units, each with its own responsibilities, leadership, and role within the broader system. For those within it, daily life did not suddenly change, as families continued to farm, hunt, and live according to the rhythms they had always known. But their place within a larger framework became more defined, connecting them to something beyond their immediate surroundings. For now, this balance held. As the system grew, it provided a sense of order that had previously been absent, reducing internal conflict and creating a more predictable environment in which cooperation could continue to develop. And with that stability came new possibilities. Trade expanded, communication improved, and decisions began to carry weight beyond a single village or group. Yet, these changes were not without tension. Not all communities accepted this shift easily, and resistance, though often quiet, remained present beneath the surface, as some questioned whether unity would bring strength or simply replace one form of uncertainty with another. Nurhaci understood this, and he did not rush. Instead, he allowed the system to prove itself over time, relying on consistency rather than force, and on gradual integration rather than sudden transformation. In this way, what might have been fragile became more stable, as each step forward reinforced the next, creating a foundation that could support further expansion. And as the years passed, his authority became more widely recognized, not only among his own people, but across the broader region, where his influence began to reshape the balance of power along the frontier. Still, from a distance, little seemed to have changed. The forests remained, the rivers continued their steady flow, and life, for most, followed patterns that felt familiar and unchanged. But beneath that surface, a new structure was taking form, one that would, in time, extend far beyond the northern lands where it began. And as this happened, the idea of unity, once uncertain, was becoming something more real, something that could be sustained, and perhaps, eventually, something that could expand. And in the years that followed, this growing system would begin to move outward, beyond alliance, beyond coordination, and toward something that more closely resembled power. Not yet an empire, but no longer just a collection of separate worlds. In the years that followed the early consolidation of Nurhaci's leadership, the northern frontier began to feel less like a collection of separate communities and more like a system in formation, where alliances held longer, decisions carried further, and identity itself started to shift in quiet but lasting ways. At first, these changes were not always visible in daily life. Families still followed the rhythms of the seasons, moving between planting, harvesting, and preparation for the long winters, while villages continued to organize themselves around familiar structures of kinship and cooperation. And yet, beneath this continuity, something was beginning to take shape. A growing sense that these communities, once defined mainly by lineage and locality, were now part of something broader, something that extended beyond any single group or territory. Nurhaci understood that unity required more than coordination. It required identity, not imposed suddenly but formed gradually, through shared symbols, shared responsibilities, and a growing awareness of belonging to a larger whole. Over time, the term Manchu began to emerge as a way of describing this evolving identity, replacing older divisions that had once separated groups from one another. It was not simply a name, it was a shift in perspective, a way of seeing the self not only in relation to family or tribe, but as part of a wider community with common purpose and direction. For many, this transition unfolded quietly. There were no sudden declarations in the villages, no clear moment when everything changed, but rather a gradual adjustment, where familiar ways of life continued, even as the meaning behind them slowly evolved. Clothing, language, and customs remained rooted in tradition, yet they were now understood within a broader framework, one that connected individuals to a system that extended beyond their immediate surroundings. Within the banner structure, this sense of identity became more defined. Each banner was not only an administrative unit, but also a social one, where people lived, worked, and organized themselves according to roles that linked them to the wider system being built. For now, this structure provided stability. It offered clarity in a world that had once been uncertain, and it allowed cooperation to deepen without requiring the complete loss of older traditions. At the same time, this emerging identity created a subtle boundary between those within the system and those outside it. To the south, the Ming Dynasty continued to represent a different kind of order, one rooted in long-established institutions, written bureaucracy, and a cultural framework shaped by centuries of imperial rule. The contrast between these two worlds was not always sharp, but it was present. On one side, a structured empire with deep traditions. On the other, a system still forming, flexible, adaptive, and shaped by the needs of the frontier. Nurhaci observed this difference carefully. He did not attempt to erase it. Instead, he worked within it, allowing the Manchu identity to develop in a way that balanced continuity with change, preserving what was familiar while introducing what was necessary. This balance was not always easy to maintain. There were moments of uncertainty, where the demands of unity seemed to press against the independence that communities had long valued. Some resisted, quietly, holding to older ways, even as the system around them continued to expand. Others adapted more quickly, recognizing that participation in this larger structure offered advantages that could not be achieved alone. Over time, these choices began to shape the direction of the emerging state, not through sudden transformation, but through accumulation. Small decisions, repeated across many lives, gradually aligning toward a shared future. And as this happened, the idea of belonging to something larger became less abstract. It became part of daily life, felt in obligations and expectations, and in the quiet understanding that one's place was now connected to a broader order. Still, from a distance, the northern lands remained much as they had always been. The forests stood, the rivers flowed, and the seasons continued their steady cycle. But within that familiar landscape, identity itself had begun to change, and with it, the possibilities of what this growing system could become. It was no longer only about survival, nor only about alliance. It was becoming something more defined, more organized, and gradually more capable of extending beyond the frontier. And in the years that followed, this new identity would begin to encounter a world that was far larger and far more complex than anything it had yet faced. As the emerging Manchu identity became more defined and the banner system brought greater stability to the northern frontier, the world beyond that frontier began to feel less distant and more present, as contact with the Ming Dynasty slowly increased in both frequency and significance. For many years, the boundary between these two worlds had been marked not only by geography, but by difference, where the Ming represented an established and deeply rooted imperial system, while the northern communities remained flexible, adaptive, and still in the process of forming something new. At first, these interactions were limited. Trade, tribute, and occasional negotiation created moments of connection, where goods moved across borders and messages passed between representatives, each side observing the other with a mixture of familiarity and distance. For now, this balance held. The Ming court viewed the northern groups through a framework it had long used to understand frontier relations, categorizing them, managing them, and, when necessary, containing them within a system that assumed the center would always remain stable. But the conditions along the frontier were no longer as predictable as they had once been. As Nurhaci's influence expanded, the internal coherence of the northern communities began to alter the balance that had previously existed, creating a situation in which the frontier was no longer defined by fragmentation, but by emerging unity. At first, this shift was subtle, difficult to measure, easy to underestimate. From the perspective of the Ming administration, these developments did not immediately appear as a direct challenge, but rather as a gradual change within a region that had always been fluid. Yet, within that fluidity, something more structured was taking shape. Nurhaci began to formalize his authority, not only as a leader among many, but as a central figure whose decisions could extend across multiple groups, creating a level of coordination that had not previously existed. This did not yet resemble an empire, but it was no longer simply a collection of alliances. In time, he would articulate grievances against the Ming, framing them not as isolated disputes, but as part of a broader justification for action, transforming tension into something more defined. These grievances, later known as the 7 Grievances, reflected both practical concerns and emerging ambition, marking a shift from negotiation toward confrontation, though even this transition unfolded gradually rather than suddenly. For those living along the frontier, daily life continued much as before. Farmers worked their fields, families gathered within their homes. Seasons passed with familiar rhythm. And yet, beyond these routines, the scale of decision-making was beginning to change. Actions taken in one place began to carry consequences in another. Messages traveled further. Responses required greater coordination, and the sense of being part of a larger system became more immediate. At the same time, the Ming Dynasty faced its own internal challenges, where administrative strain, resource pressures, and the demands of governing a vast territory created conditions in which attention could not always be evenly maintained across all regions. This did not mean the system was failing, but it did mean that its ability to respond was no longer as consistent as it had once been. Nurhaci observed this carefully. He did not rush into direct confrontation. Instead, he continued to strengthen his position, allowing the structures he had built to mature, ensuring that when change came, it would be supported by a foundation capable of sustaining it. In this way, expansion was not driven by sudden movement, but by preparation. Each step forward was measured, each decision considered within the broader context of what might follow. And as this process continued, the boundary between the northern world and the Ming realm became less stable, not through dramatic shifts, but through gradual pressure, where the distance between them seemed to narrow over time. What had once been a frontier now began to feel like a point of contact, a place where two systems, different in origin and structure, were beginning to interact more directly. And within that interaction, the possibility of change grew stronger. Still, from a distance, the larger patterns of life appeared unchanged. The land remained as it had always been. The rhythms of daily existence continued without interruption, and the structures of both worlds still held. But beneath that appearance of stability, the conditions were shifting, quietly, persistently, and in the years that followed, this growing pressure would begin to move beyond contact and towards something more decisive, as the balance between these two worlds would no longer remain as it had been, not through a single moment, but through a series of changes that would gradually reshape the course of both. By the early 17th century, as Nurhaci's authority continued to consolidate across the northern frontier, the Ming Dynasty remained vast, established, and outwardly stable. Yet beneath its structured appearance, pressures had already begun to accumulate in ways that were not always immediately visible. At the center, the imperial court in Beijing continued to function with formality and order, where officials recorded, debated, and administered the affairs of a realm that stretched across immense distances, relying on systems that had been refined over generations. For a long time, this had been enough. But over time, the demands placed upon that system had grown heavier. Population had increased. Resources were stretched, and the effort required to maintain balance across such a large empire had begun to rise, slowly but persistently. In distant provinces, these changes were felt more clearly. Local officials, tasked with collecting taxes and maintaining order, often found themselves navigating conditions that were no longer as predictable as before, where harvests varied, obligations remained fixed, and the distance between policy and reality became more difficult to bridge. For many ordinary families, life continued much as it always had, shaped by the land and the seasons, yet small pressures began to appear. A heavier burden here, a delay there, a sense that stability required more effort than it once had. At first, these shifts were easy to overlook. They did not disrupt the visible structure of the empire. They did not immediately alter the routines of daily life, but they accumulated, quietly, and over time they began to matter. Within the administrative system, strain appeared in subtle ways, where communication slowed, decisions were delayed, and the coordination required to manage distant regions became less consistent. This did not signal collapse, but it suggested imbalance, and imbalance, even when slight, could grow. At the same time, the frontier to the north was changing. What had once been a region of fragmented groups was now increasingly shaped by a more unified structure, where Nurhaci's leadership had introduced coordination, identity, and a system capable of acting with greater cohesion. For the Ming, this shift was not immediately understood as a direct threat. It appeared gradual, manageable, contained within the familiar patterns of frontier relations. Yet the nature of that frontier was no longer the same. For the first time, it was not simply a boundary, but a space where two different visions of order were beginning to exist side by side. One long established, one still forming, but steadily gaining strength. Nurhaci did not move quickly. He continued to observe, to consolidate, and to prepare, allowing his system to mature rather than forcing immediate confrontation. He understood that timing mattered. That strength was not only measured in numbers, but in readiness, and that a system, once stable enough, could extend its influence far beyond its original boundaries. In the years leading up to open conflict, tensions increased in ways that were not always dramatic, but were nonetheless significant, where disputes over territory, allegiance, and authority began to carry greater weight than they had before. Messages passed between the two sides. Responses were measured. But beneath this exchange, the distance between them was narrowing, not physically, but structurally. Each side representing a different approach to order, governance, and control. For those living far from the centers of power, these developments remained distant. Fields were still tended, markets still opened, families still gathered in the evenings as they always had. And the decisions being made beyond their immediate world were beginning to shape the conditions in which they lived. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, the balance between stability and strain began to shift. What had once been manageable became more demanding. What had once been predictable became less certain. And the system that had long held the empire together began to require more than it could easily sustain. This was not yet collapse, nor was it even crisis, but it was the beginning of something, a quiet transition, where the weight of maintaining order began to approach the limits of what that order could support. And at the same time, beyond the Great Wall, a different kind of system was becoming ready. Not larger, not yet more powerful, but more aligned, more coordinated, and increasingly capable of acting as a single force. For now, the two worlds still held, each within its own structure, each within its own rhythm. But the distance between them was no longer secure, and in the years that followed, this growing imbalance would begin to move from pressure into action, as the conditions for conflict, once distant, would gradually come into view. Not all at once, but step by step, until change could no longer be contained. In the years that followed, the growing imbalance between the Ming Dynasty and the rising power in the north, the frontier could no longer be understood as a quiet boundary, as tensions that had once remained contained began to move more visibly into action. This transition did not begin with a single decisive moment. There was no clear line where peace ended and conflict began. Instead, it unfolded gradually, through a series of movements, decisions, and responses that, taken together, began to alter the relationship between the two sides. By this time, Nurhaci's authority had become firmly established among the Manchu, supported by the banner system and a growing sense of unity that allowed his forces to act with coordination that had not previously existed in the region. Across the frontier, the Ming administration continued to rely on its established structures, deploying regional commanders, reinforcing garrisons, and maintaining defensive lines that had long served to manage instability along its borders. For a time, these systems still held, but they were no longer evenly matched in the ways that mattered most. The Ming system, though vast, required constant input to maintain its balance, while Nurhaci's structure, smaller but more focused, could respond with greater speed and cohesion. At first, engagements between the two sides were limited, localized, often framed as responses to specific disputes rather than as part of a larger conflict. Small forces moved across contested areas. Fortifications were tested. Positions were gained and lost. Yet, even in these early encounters, a pattern began to emerge. Nurhaci's forces, organized through the banner system, demonstrated a level of coordination that allowed them to adapt quickly, while Ming responses, though substantial, were sometimes slowed by the distance between command and action. This difference did not immediately determine outcomes, but it shaped them over time. As each side learned more about the other, strategies adjusted, expectations shifted, and what had once been a series of isolated incidents began to take on the character of a broader confrontation. For those living near the frontier, the effects were more immediate. Routes that had once been used for trade became uncertain. Movement slowed, and the sense of distance that had once separated daily life from distant decisions began to diminish. Villages adapted as they always had, but with greater caution, watching the horizon more closely, listening for changes that could no longer be ignored. Within the Ming system, the increasing pressure revealed deeper challenges. Commanders were tasked with responding to a threat that did not behave as previous ones had, where coordination and adaptability made it difficult to apply familiar strategies with consistent success. Resources were directed toward the frontier. Reinforcements were organized, yet the scale of the empire meant that response was not always immediate and not always aligned. Nurhaci, meanwhile, continued to move with patience. He did not seek rapid expansion for its own sake. Instead, he focused on maintaining momentum, ensuring that each engagement strengthened his position, both materially and psychologically. Victories, even small ones, contributed to a growing sense of confidence within his ranks, reinforcing the belief that their system could continue to expand beyond its original limits. At the same time, the framing of conflict began to change. What had once been seen as a series of disputes was increasingly understood, on both sides, as part of a larger struggle, one that would not be resolved through isolated actions alone. Still, this was not yet total war. The broader structures of both systems remained intact. Daily life, for most, continued, and the rhythms of the land did not immediately yield to the movements of armies. But the direction had shifted. What had been pressure was now becoming motion. What had been uncertainty was becoming pattern. And what had been contained was beginning to expand. In the years that followed, these early movements would grow in scale and consequence, as the balance between the Ming Dynasty and the rising Manchu state would be tested more directly, not only at the frontier, but across regions where the stability of one system would increasingly depend on its ability to respond to the other, not through a single decisive clash, but through a continuation of change, where each step forward made the next one more difficult to avoid. In the years that followed the first movements of war along the northern frontier, the Ming Dynasty continued to function as an empire, its institutions still in place, its authority still recognized across vast regions, and its structure still capable of maintaining order. And yet, within that structure, the effort required to sustain balance had begun to increase in ways that were no longer evenly distributed. At the center, the court in Beijing remained formal and composed, where officials debated policy, recorded events, and issued directives intended to guide the empire through a period that, on the surface, still appeared manageable. For now, the system held, but the conditions beneath it were changing. Across provinces, local administrators found themselves facing growing challenges where the responsibilities of governance did not lessen, even as the resources available to meet them became less certain. Harvests varied. Transport slowed. Communication, though still functioning, required more time and coordination than before. These were not failures, not yet, but they were signs, and over time they began to accumulate. For those living far from the capital, these changes were felt less as a sudden disruption and more as a gradual shift in the texture of daily life, where expectations remained the same, but the effort required to meet them grew heavier. Taxes still had to be collected, obligations still had to be fulfilled, and yet the margin for error became smaller. A missed harvest carried greater consequence. A delayed shipment mattered more than it once had. At first, such changes could be managed, communities adapted, as they always had, but adaptation required energy, and energy, over time, could be exhausted. Within the military structure, similar patterns appeared. Garrisons remained in place. Commanders continued to receive orders, and defenses along the frontier were still maintained. Yet, the coordination between these elements was no longer as consistent as before, where distance, delay, and differing conditions across regions made unified response more difficult to achieve. This did not mean that the Ming had lost control, but it did mean that control required more effort, and that effort was not always evenly available. At the same time, beyond the Great Wall, the Manchu system continued to strengthen. Nurhaci's forces, organized and increasingly experienced, were no longer simply testing the boundaries of Ming authority, but applying steady pressure in ways that revealed the limits of a system stretched across distance. He did not rely on a single decisive victory. Instead, he allowed momentum to build, step by step, engagement by engagement, each action reinforcing the next. Within his ranks, confidence grew, not as sudden certainty, but as a gradual recognition that their system could sustain expansion, not through size alone, but through alignment, coordination, and timing. For those observing from within the Ming administration, the situation remained complex. The empire was still vast, still capable, still functioning. And yet, the nature of the challenge it faced was different from those of the past. It was not only external, but structural. Not only a matter of defense, but of capacity. The ability to respond, to adapt, and to maintain balance under increasing strain. For a time, this complexity delayed clear recognition of the depth of the problem. Decisions were made, adjustments attempted, but the scale of the system made rapid change difficult. And in that delay, pressure continued to grow. In the countryside, life continued its familiar patterns. Fields were planted, markets opened, families gathered at the end of each day. And yet, beneath these routines, there was a growing awareness, not always spoken, but quietly understood, that stability was no longer as certain as it once had been. Not broken, but less assured. And as this awareness spread, it began to shape behavior in subtle ways. Caution increased, expectations shifted, and the sense of continuity, though still present, felt more fragile. This was not yet collapse, nor was it a moment that could be clearly identified as a turning point. But it was something else. A gradual loss of balance, where the systems that had long sustained the empire began to require more than they could easily provide, and where the difference between maintaining order and losing it became narrower with each passing year. Still, the empire endured. Its structures remained. Its authority continued, and from a distance it still appeared as it always had. But beneath that appearance, the conditions were changing, quietly, persistently. And in the years that followed, these changes would begin to move beyond strain and into consequence, as events unfolded that would make visible what had, until now, remained beneath the surface. Not suddenly, but in ways that could no longer be ignored. In the years that followed the gradual loss of balance within the Ming Dynasty, the pressures that had long remained beneath the surface began to take on a more visible form, not as a sudden collapse, but as a series of developments that made it increasingly difficult to maintain the appearance of stability. At the center, the court in Beijing continued to function, its rituals unchanged, its officials still engaged in the work of governance, and its authority still extending across the empire in ways that, from a distance, suggested continuity. For a time, this continuity remained convincing, but the conditions required to sustain it were no longer evenly present. Across the provinces, the strain that had once been subtle became more pronounced. where the gap between expectation and reality widened, and where the ability of local systems to absorb pressure began to weaken. Communication slowed further. Resources became harder to coordinate, and decisions, though still made, did not always carry the same effect as before. For many, life continued along familiar paths. Fields were tended, markets opened, families gathered at the close of each day. And yet, within these routines, there was a growing awareness that something had shifted, not in a single moment, but in a way that could now be felt more clearly than before. Not broken, but no longer steady. At the same time, along the northern frontier, the nature of a conflict was beginning to change. What had once been a series of engagements was now becoming more sustained, as Nurhaci's forces moved with increasing confidence, applying pressure not only at isolated points, but across broader areas where the Ming system was already under strain. He did not act without consideration, nor did he move without preparation. Each advance was measured, supported by a structure that had been built over years, allowing movement to be maintained rather than forced. And this difference began to matter more. Where the Ming response required coordination across distance, Nurhaci's system could act with greater cohesion, aligning effort in ways that were difficult to counter consistently. At first, these changes appeared as setbacks, manageable, part of a larger pattern that could still be corrected. But over time, the accumulation of these setbacks began to alter perception, both within the administration and among those who observed from a distance. Confidence, once assumed, required reinforcement, and reinforcement required resources, time, energy, all of which were becoming less certain. Within the military structure, defensive lines that had once served as stable points of control began to require more frequent attention, where maintaining position became as demanding as expanding it, and where the distinction between holding and losing ground grew less clear. Commanders adapted as they could. But adaptation, within a system already under strain, was not always sufficient. Meanwhile, beyond the immediate movements of armies, the broader structure of the Ming state continued to feel the weight of the accumulated pressure. Administrative delays extended further. Local conditions diverged more sharply, and the ability to maintain a consistent sense of order across the empire became increasingly difficult to sustain. This was not yet the end, but it was no longer only a warning, it was a transition, where the effects of imbalance began to move from potential into consequence. For those living within the empire, this transition was not always experienced as a single defining moment, but as a gradual shift in expectation, where certainty gave way to caution, and where the future felt less predictable than it once had. Still, life continued, as it always does, and the rhythms of the land did not immediately yield to the changes unfolding beyond them. But the connection between those rhythms and the larger system that supported them was no longer as secure, and this change, once subtle, was becoming more difficult to ignore. At the same time, Nurhaci's position had reached a point where expansion was no longer simply possible, but increasingly inevitable, as the structure he had built allowed for sustained movement beyond the frontier, supported by alignment, coordination, and a growing understanding of how to engage with a system larger than his own. This did not yet mean complete transformation, but it marked the beginning of a new phase, where one system, long established, began to yield under pressure, and another, once peripheral, moved steadily toward the center. And in the years that followed, this shift would become more visible, as the balance that had defined the relationship between these two worlds would no longer hold in the same way, not because it disappeared all at once, but because it could no longer be maintained. And from that point forward, the path toward a new order would begin to take shape. In the years that followed the weakening of Ming control along the northern frontier, the balance that had long defined the relationship between the two sides continued to shift, not abruptly, but in a way that made the emergence of a new order increasingly difficult to avoid. By this time, the system built by Nurhaci had reached a level of cohesion that allowed it to move beyond the limitations of its origins, no longer defined solely by the frontier, but shaped by a growing capacity to operate across wider regions with consistency and intent. This was not yet an empire in the form that would later be recognized, but it had begun to take on the qualities of one: structure, continuity, and the ability to extend influence beyond immediate necessity. Following Nurhaci's death in 1626, leadership passed to his son, Hong Taiji, who inherited not only the foundations of a unified system, but also the conditions of a changing world, where opportunity and pressure existed side by side. At first, the transition of leadership did not disrupt the system. The banners remained in place, the structure held, and daily life, for many, continued within familiar patterns shaped by the land and the seasons. For now, stability endured. But Hong Taiji recognized that maintaining what had been built would not be enough. The system needed to evolve, not through sudden change, but through careful adjustment. He began to expand and refine the administrative structure, integrating not only the existing Manchu population, but also incorporating increasing numbers of Han Chinese and Mongol groups into the broader framework, allowing the system to grow in both scale and complexity. This process was gradual and at times uneven, but it introduced a new dimension, where identity, once centered on shared origin, began to expand into something more inclusive and shaped by participation within the system rather than by lineage alone. In doing so, Hong Taiji extended the reach of the emerging state, not only across territory, but across identity itself. For those living within this structure, the change was subtle. Families continued their routines, villages maintained their rhythms, and the visible patterns of life remained largely unchanged. And yet, the system that connected these lives was becoming more expansive, linking different groups into a shared framework that allowed coordination to extend further than before. At the same time, beyond the northern lands, the Ming Dynasty continued to face the consequences of its internal strain, where maintaining control required increasing effort, and where the ability to respond to external pressure was no longer as consistent as it had once been. Hong Taiji observed this carefully. He did not rely solely on force. Instead, he focused on strengthening the system itself, ensuring that expansion, when it came, would be supported by a structure capable of sustaining it. One of his most significant decisions was to formally rename the Yurshan people as Manchu, reinforcing the identity that had been gradually taking shape, and to declare a new dynastic name, Qing, marking a shift from a regional power to an entity that now saw itself in imperial terms. This was not merely symbolic, it was structural, a redefinition of how the system understood itself, and how it intended to be understood by others. For now, and this transformation did not immediately alter the experience of daily life. Fields were still cultivated, markets still functioned, and the rhythms of ordinary existence continued. But the meaning behind those rhythms had begun to change. They were no longer part of a frontier system alone. They were becoming part of something larger, something that now moved with greater clarity toward the center of power. Still, this transition remained incomplete. The Ming Dynasty had not yet fallen. Its institutions still stood. Its authority, though strained, still extended across much of China. and the outcome of this shifting balance had not yet been decided, but the direction was becoming clearer. What had once been a peripheral force was now moving steadily toward the center, not through sudden conquest, but through accumulation, alignment, and the gradual strengthening of a system that had learned how to sustain itself. And in the years that followed, this emerging empire would begin to test its ability to move beyond the frontier entirely, as the question was no longer whether change would come, but how far it would reach. As the Qing identity became more clearly defined under Hong Taiji, the system that supported it continued to expand in ways that were not always visible at first, yet steadily reshaped how authority was organized, applied, and experienced across the regions it touched. This was a period not of sudden transformation, but of careful structuring. Few were the foundations of governance were extended and adjusted to accommodate a growing and increasingly diverse population, one that now included not only the Manchu, but also large numbers of Han Chinese and Mongol communities. At the center of this development was the need for balance. Balance between continuity and change, between inherited traditions and newly formed structures, and between the expectations of those who governed and the realities of those who lived within the system. For a time, this balance held. The banner system, originally designed to organize Manchu society, continued to function as both a military and social framework, while new administrative practices were introduced to manage regions that required different forms of governance. This did not replace what had existed before, but it layered additional structure upon it, allowing the system to grow without losing its internal cohesion. Within this expanding framework, authority became more clearly distributed. Decisions made at higher levels began to move more consistently through defined channels, reaching local administrators who were responsible for translating those decisions into everyday practice. For many people, this process remained distant. They did not see the structures directly, but they experienced their effects. In the timing of obligations, in the organization of labor, and in the expectations that shaped daily life. In villages, life continued as it always had, guided by the land, the seasons, and the quiet repetition of familiar routines. Fields were prepared, crops were tended, and families worked together within patterns that had long provided stability. Yet now, these routines existed within a broader system that connected them more directly to a central authority, one that extended its reach not through constant presence, but through consistent structure. Taxes were collected with greater regularity. Records were maintained with increased precision, and the relationship between local life and distant governance became more defined, even when it remained largely unseen. At the same time, the Qing leadership continued to refine how different populations were integrated into the system. Policies were shaped not only by immediate need, but by an awareness that stability depended on the ability to manage diversity without forcing uniformity. This required patience, adjustment, and an understanding that governance was not only about control, but about alignment. For now, this approach proved effective. The system expanded, coordination improved, and the capacity to manage larger territories began to take form. Yet, this growth also introduced new challenges. As the system became more complex, the effort required to maintain its balance increased, where differences between regions, expectations, and conditions required constant attention. This was not yet a source of strain, but it was a condition, one that would shape how the system developed over time. For those within the administration, these changes meant adapting to new forms of responsibility, where governance was no longer confined to familiar structures, but extended into areas that required different approaches and new ways of thinking. And for those outside it, life continued with only gradual awareness that the system around them had grown more intricate, more connected, and more capable of shaping outcomes beyond the immediate reach of local decisions. Still, from a distance, the larger picture remained one of stability. The Qing system appeared to be settling into place, its structures aligning, its authority extending, and its ability to govern becoming more consistent with each passing year. But even within this stability, there were elements that required careful attention. Points where balance depended on continued effort, where coordination depended on constant adjustment, and where the success of the system relied not only on its structure, but on its ability to adapt. For now, these elements remained in equilibrium. The system held, and life within it moved forward with a sense of continuity that suggested durability. Yet, as this happened, the scale of what had been created continued to grow, and with that growth came the question of how far it could extend, not only across territory, but across time. And in the years that followed, this expanding structure would begin to encounter new conditions that would test its ability to maintain the balance it had so carefully established. In the years that followed the steady shaping of Qing governance, the system began to settle into a form that felt increasingly complete, where structure, coordination, and continuity aligned in ways that gave the impression of a stable and enduring order. This was not the result of a single decision, nor of any sudden transformation, but rather the outcome of many adjustments, repeated over time, that gradually brought the different parts of the empire into closer alignment. At the center, authority became more clearly defined, not only through formal institutions, but through the consistency with which those institutions operated, allowing decisions to move with greater reliability from the imperial court outward to the regions beyond. For those within the administration, this period carried a sense of coherence. Processes became more predictable, responsibilities more clearly understood, and the relationship between central direction and local implementation more stable than it had been in earlier years. For now, this stability held across the empire. The effects of this alignment were felt in subtle but meaningful ways. Communication improved. Coordination between regions became more consistent, and the system as a whole began to function with a rhythm that suggested durability rather than uncertainty. In rural areas, life continued within familiar patterns, shaped by the land and the seasons, where daily routines unfolded much as they always had, and where the presence of the state was experienced not as constant intervention, but as a framework within which those routines could continue. Fields were cultivated, harvests gathered, and local communities organized themselves around cycles that remained largely unchanged. Yet these patterns now existed within a system that was more connected than before, where decisions made far from the village could influence conditions in ways that, while not always visible, were increasingly consistent. In the cities, the effects were different. Markets expanded. Trade became more regular, and the movement of goods and information followed routes that were more reliably maintained, creating a sense of flow that linked distant regions into a more integrated whole. This integration did not remove difference, but it allowed difference to exist within a shared structure, where variation between regions could be managed without disrupting the overall balance of the system. At the same time, the Qing leadership continued to refine how authority was expressed, balancing the need for control with the recognition that stability depended on cooperation, not only within the administration, but across the diverse populations that made up the empire. Policies were adjusted, practices refined, and over time the system developed a capacity not only to govern, but to sustain governance, maintaining continuity across conditions that might otherwise have caused disruption. For those observing from within the empire, this period could feel steady, even settled, as if the structures that had been built were now capable of supporting themselves without constant adjustment. But this sense of stability was not without its conditions. It depended on continued alignment, on the consistent functioning of institutions, and on the ability of the system to respond to change without losing balance. For now, these conditions were met. The empire appeared strong, its authority recognized, its structure coherent, and its future, at least in appearance, secure. Yet, even within this period of relative stability, the scale of what had been created carried its own implications. As the system expanded, the effort required to maintain its balance did not disappear. It grew, quietly, in ways that were not always immediately visible. Differences between regions required ongoing attention. Coordination across distance demanded constant adjustment. And the success of the system depended not only on its structure, but on its ability to continue adapting as conditions changed. These were not yet problems, but they were part of the system, present even at its height, and shaping how it would respond to what lay ahead. For those living within this world, however, such considerations remained distant. Life continued, as it always does, guided by routines that felt stable, within a system that appeared to support them. And for a time, this was enough. But as the years passed, and as the empire continued to extend its reach, new conditions would begin to emerge, testing not only the strength of its structure, but the limits of the balance it had achieved. Not immediately, not dramatically, but in ways that would gradually become more difficult to ignore. As the Qing Empire continued to function with a sense of order and stability, the structures that supported it remained largely intact, and for many, life still unfolded within patterns that felt familiar, predictable, and secure. Yet over time, beneath this appearance of continuity, small changes began to emerge, not as disruptions, but as subtle shifts in the way the system responded to the demands placed upon it. At first, these changes were difficult to notice. They did not alter the visible shape of the empire. They did not interrupt the routines of daily life, but they were present in the way decisions took slightly longer to reach distant regions, in the effort required to maintain coordination across expanding administrative networks, and in the growing complexity of managing a system that now extended across vast and varied landscapes. For now, these adjustments were manageable. The system adapted, as it always had, through refinement, repetition, and the continued effort of those who worked within it. Officials recorded, organized, and responded to conditions as they arose, maintaining the flow of governance with a consistency that suggested resilience. In many regions, life continued without any clear sense that change was underway. Farmers followed the seasons. Markets opened and closed with regular rhythm. Families lived within structures that had provided stability for generations. And yet, within these familiar patterns, the connection between local experience and central authority was becoming more layered, where the path between decision and outcome involved more steps, more coordination, and more time. This did not weaken the system immediately, but it altered how it functioned, in subtle ways. Across the administration, the expansion of the empire brought with it an increase in responsibility, where managing diversity required not only policy, but interpretation, and where consistency depended on the ability of local officials to adapt central directives to conditions that were not always uniform. This introduced variation, not as disorder, but as difference. And over time, these differences required attention, more communication, more adjustment, more effort to maintain alignment. At the same time, the scale of the empire meant that resources, while still substantial, had to be distributed across greater distances, where priorities shifted, demands increased, and the balance between regions required careful consideration. For now, this balance was maintained, but it depended on continued attention, on the steady functioning of institutions, and on the ability of the system to respond without delay. These conditions, though still present, were no longer as effortless as they had once seemed. They required maintenance, and maintenance, over time, could become demanding. For those within the administration, this was not immediately understood as a problem. It was part of governance, an expected aspect of managing a large and complex system. And yet, even within this understanding, there was a gradual awareness that the effort required to sustain stability was increasing, not dramatically, but steadily. For those outside the administrative structure, the effects remained less direct. Life continued, as it always does, shaped by the land, the seasons, and the quiet expectations of routine. But the system that supported these routines was becoming more intricate, more interconnected, and more dependent on its ability to maintain balance across conditions that were not always aligned. Still, from a distance, the empire appeared unchanged. Its authority remained, its structure held, and its capacity to govern seemed intact. But beneath that appearance, the nature of that capacity was evolving, not weakening, but becoming more complex. And with complexity came new conditions. Conditions that required attention, adjustment, and continued effort to sustain. These were not yet cracks in the sense of visible breakdown, but they were the early signs of strain, where the difference between maintaining balance and losing it became slightly narrower. And though this narrowing was gradual, almost imperceptible, it would, over time, begin to shape how the empire responded to the challenges that lay ahead. Not through sudden change, but through accumulation, where each small adjustment added to the next, and where the system, still strong, began to move toward a state that would require more than it once had to remain as it was. As the Qing Empire continued to extend its reach across vast territories, the structures that had once brought stability now carried a different kind of responsibility, where expansion, though a sign of strength, also introduced new layers of demand that required careful management. At this stage, the empire was no longer defined by formation alone. It had entered a phase where maintaining what had been built became as important as building further. And this shift, though subtle, began to shape how the system functioned from within. For a time, expansion had provided momentum. New regions brought resources. New populations strengthened the structure, and the system, still adapting, was able to absorb these additions without immediate strain. But over time, the scale of what needed to be managed grew. Distances increased. Differences between regions became more pronounced, and the effort required to maintain coordination across such diversity began to rise. This was not yet imbalance, but it was pressure, a steady increase in the demands placed upon the system, where maintaining alignment required more attention, more communication, and more adjustment than before. Within the administration, this pressure appeared in practical ways. Officials were responsible not only for maintaining order within their own regions, but also for ensuring that their actions aligned with a broader structure that now extended far beyond immediate visibility. This required interpretation, judgment, and the ability to adapt central expectations to local conditions that were not always consistent. For now, this work continued, the system functioned, and the sense of stability remained. But the effort behind that stability was growing, often unseen, yet constant. In the countryside, the effects were less direct, but still present. Communities continued their routines, guided by the land and the seasons. Yet, the structures that connected them to the wider empire became more defined, where obligations were clearer, expectations more consistent, and the link between local life and distant authority more structured. At first, this provided clarity, a sense of order, but over time it also required greater responsiveness, where changes in policy or condition could carry more immediate impact than they once had. This was not disruption, but it was adjustment, and adjustment, repeated across many lives, required energy. At the same time, the diversity of the empire introduced complexity that could not always be resolved through uniform approaches. Different regions required different responses. Different conditions required different strategies. And the ability of the system to manage these differences became central to maintaining balance. For now, this balance was preserved through effort, through coordination, and through the continued functioning of institutions that had been carefully shaped over time. But the nature of that balance was changing. It was no longer sustained by structure alone. It depended increasingly on the ability of individuals within the system to interpret, respond, and adapt. This introduced variation, not as disorder, but as difference in execution. And over time, these differences could accumulate, quietly, gradually, in ways that were not always immediately visible. For those observing from within the empire, this period could still feel stable, even prosperous. The structures remained. The authority held, and the system continued to function with a degree of consistency that suggested strength. Yet, beneath this consistency, the weight of maintaining such a system had begun to grow, not as a burden that could be easily identified, but as a condition that required ongoing attention, effort that could not be reduced, coordination that could not be simplified, and adaptation that could not be avoided. Still, this was not yet a point of strain. The system held, and its ability to function remained intact. But the conditions that would later shape its challenges were already present, embedded within the very processes that allowed it to expand. And as the years passed, these conditions would begin to interact with one another. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but in ways that would gradually increase the complexity of maintaining balance, until the effort required to sustain the system would begin to approach the limits of what it could provide. Not yet, but inevitably. And in the years that followed, this growing weight would begin to reveal itself more clearly, as the structures that had once supported expansion would be tested by the very scale they had created. As the Qing Empire continued to operate across vast distances, the structures that had once allowed it to function with clarity and coordination remained in place. Yet the way those structures performed began to change in subtle but important ways. At first, this change was not easily recognized. The system still worked. Orders were issued, records were kept, and the routines of governance continued to move forward with a sense of continuity that suggested stability. For now, nothing appeared broken, but over time the efficiency with which the system operated began to shift, not dramatically, but gradually, in ways that affected how quickly decisions could be made, how accurately they could be applied, and how consistently they could be maintained across regions that differed in both condition and need. This was not a failure of structure. The framework itself remained sound, but the scale at which it operated had grown, and with that growth came an increase in the distance between intention and outcome. Within the administration, this change was experienced as a growing need for coordination. More communication was required, more verification, more time between decision and implementation. And while each of these adjustments was manageable on its own, together they began to alter the rhythm of governance. Where once processes had moved with relative ease, they now required greater effort to achieve the same result. For those working within the system, this did not immediately signal concern. It was understood as a part of managing a large and complex empire. And yet, even within this understanding, there was a quiet awareness that maintaining efficiency now required more attention than before. At the local level, these changes were less visible, but still present. Policies arrived with slight delays. Instructions required clarification. And the connection between central authority and local practice became more dependent on interpretation, where the success of governance relied increasingly on how well individuals could adapt directives to their specific conditions. This did not create disorder, but it introduced variation. And variation, over time, could lead to inconsistency. In some regions, administration remained highly effective. In others, it became uneven, not because the system had failed, but because its performance depended on factors that were not always aligned: distance, communication, local conditions, and the capacity of those responsible for implementation. For now, these differences remained contained. The overall structure continued to hold, and the empire, viewed as a whole, still appeared stable and capable. But beneath that appearance, the uniformity that had once supported efficiency was becoming more difficult to maintain. At the same time, the continued expansion of responsibilities meant that resources, though still present, had to be distributed with increasing care, where priorities shifted, demands overlapped, and the balance between regions required ongoing adjustment. This was not yet strain, but it was movement toward it, a gradual shift in how the system functioned, where effort increased, and ease became less certain. For those living within the empire, these changes were not always noticeable. Life continued, fields were cultivated, markets functioned, families moved through their routines with the same quiet rhythm that had long defined daily existence. But the system that supported these routines was no longer operating with the same level of simplicity it once had. It had become more intricate, more dependent on coordination, and more sensitive to variation. Still, the empire endured. Its authority remained, its structure intact, and its capacity to govern still evident. Yet the nature of that capacity was evolving, not weakening, but becoming less efficient in ways that required continued attention to maintain balance. These were not yet signs of decline, but they were indicators of change, where the difference between functioning and functioning well began to matter more than before. And though this difference was small, at first, it would, over time, begin to shape how the system responded to the challenges that would follow, not through sudden disruption, but through accumulation, where each small inefficiency added to the next, and where the effort required to maintain order continued to rise, quietly, gradually, until the balance that once seemed natural would begin to feel increasingly difficult to sustain. As the Qing Empire continued to function across its vast and varied landscape, the structures that had long supported its authority remained visible, and for many, the sense of stability that defined earlier years still appeared to endure, shaped by routines, institutions, and expectations that had not yet visibly changed. From a distance, the empire seemed intact. Its administration still operated, its systems still connected distant regions, and its authority, though increasingly complex, remained recognizable. For now, this appearance was convincing. Yet beneath this continuity, the nature of stability itself had begun to shift, not in a way that could be easily seen, but in how it was sustained. Where once balance had emerged from alignment between structure, capacity, and condition, it now depended more heavily on continued effort, constant adjustment, and the ability to manage differences that were no longer evenly distributed. This did not immediately alter outcomes. The system still worked, life continued, and the rhythms of daily existence remained largely unchanged. But the foundation beneath that continuity had become less certain, where stability no longer rested on ease, but on maintenance. For those within the administration, this change was understood in practical terms. Tasks required more attention. Decisions required more coordination, and the margin for error, though still manageable, had begun to narrow. At first, these adjustments were absorbed, as they always had been, through effort, through adaptation, and through the continued functioning of institutions that had long provided structure. But over time, the accumulation of these adjustments began to alter the experience of governance, where maintaining consistency required more than it once had, and where the difference between success and difficulty became more dependent on circumstance. At the local level, these shifts were even less visible. Villages continued their routines. Fields were cultivated. Markets opened and closed with familiar rhythm, and families lived within patterns that felt unchanged. Yet, the connection between these routines and the broader system that supported them had become more delicate, where stability depended not only on local conditions, but on the continued effectiveness of structures that were now operating with increasing complexity. For now, this connection held. The system continued to support daily life, and the appearance of continuity remained strong. But the nature of that support had changed. It was no longer effortless. It required alignment that was not always easy to maintain, and coordination that depended on conditions that were not always stable. Still, the empire endured. Its presence remained. Its authority continued. And for many, there was little reason to believe that anything fundamental had shifted. This was the nature of the illusion. Not a false reality, but a partial one, where what was visible remained consistent, even as what sustained it had begun to change. And because these changes were gradual, because they unfolded across time rather than in a single moment, they did not immediately alter perception. They did not create urgency. They did not disrupt the sense of continuity that shaped everyday life. Instead, they existed beneath that continuity, quietly, persistently. And as they accumulated, they began to shape the conditions under which the system would need to respond to future challenges. Not by removing stability, but by making it more difficult to sustain. For now, this difference remained subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was present, in the growing effort required to maintain order, in the increasing dependence on coordination, and in the narrowing space between balance and strain. And though the empire still appeared stable, still functioned, still endured, the nature of that stability had begun to change, and in the years that followed, this difference between appearance and condition would become more difficult to maintain, as the system, still strong, would begin to encounter pressures that could no longer be absorbed in the same way. Not suddenly, not all at once, but gradually, as the illusion of stability gave way to the reality beneath it. In the years that followed the quiet persistence of stability across the Qing Empire, the conditions that had long remained beneath the surface began, gradually, to take on a more visible form, not as sudden disruption, but as a shift in how the system responded to the demands placed upon it. For a long time, the empire had maintained balance through structure, coordination, and the steady functioning of institutions that connected distant regions into a coherent whole. But over time, the effort required to sustain that balance had continued to increase, and now, in subtle but noticeable ways, that effort was beginning to show. At the center, governance still operated. Decisions were made, policies were issued, and the framework of authority remained intact. Yet, the path from intention to outcome was no longer as direct as it once had been, where implementation required more steps, more adjustment, and more time to achieve the same result. For now, this did not interrupt the overall functioning of the system, but it altered its responsiveness. in ways that could be felt, even when they were not fully understood. Across the provinces, the variation that had once been manageable began to widen, where differences in condition, resource availability, and administrative capacity created uneven results, even when policies remained consistent. Some regions continued to function with relative stability. Others required increasing attention, and the effort to maintain alignment across these differences grew more demanding. This was no longer only complexity, it was pressure, a condition in which the system could still operate, but only through continued and increasing effort, where balance depended not on ease, but on sustained attention. For those within the administration, this shift became more apparent. Tasks that had once been routine now required greater coordination. Delays, though often minor, became more frequent, and the need to interpret and adjust directives became more central to maintaining order. At the local level, these changes began to shape experience in quiet ways. Obligations remained, but meeting them required more care. Expectations persisted, but fulfilling them was no longer as certain as before. This did not create immediate disruption. Life continued. Fields were cultivated. Markets functioned. Families moved through their days with the same steady rhythm. And yet, within that rhythm, there was a growing sense that maintaining stability required more than it once had. For now, this was enough. The system held. Its structures remained, and its authority continued to be recognized, but the conditions under which it operated had changed. Where once stability had been supported by alignment, it now depended on effort. Where once coordination had been consistent, it now required adjustment. And where once balance had seemed natural, it now required maintenance. At the same time, the scale of the empire meant that responding to these conditions was not simple. Changes in one region did not always align with conditions in another. Decisions required time to move across distance, and the capacity to respond quickly was limited by the very size of the system. This did not weaken the empire immediately, but it shaped how it could adapt, and adaptation over time would become increasingly important. For those observing from within, this period could still feel stable, even secure. The structures remained visible, the routines continued, and the sense of continuity had not yet been broken. But beneath that continuity, the nature of stability had shifted. It was no longer something that could be assumed. It had become something that needed to be maintained. And as the years passed, this distinction would begin to matter more, as the pressures that had once been manageable continued to grow, not suddenly, not dramatically, but steadily, until the system, still intact, would begin to encounter conditions that required more than it could easily provide. And in that moment, the difference between stability and strain would become more than a subtle shift. It would become something that could no longer be overlooked. As the Qing Empire continued to sustain its vast structure under growing pressure, one of the most significant changes began to emerge not from policy or conflict, but from within the population itself, where gradual increases over time began to reshape the balance between people, land, and resources. For many years, population growth had been a sign of stability. Communities expanded, families grew, and the presence of more people suggested continuity, prosperity, and the capacity of the land to support those who depended upon it. At first, this growth was absorbed. New land was cultivated, existing systems adjusted, and the empire, still expanding, appeared capable of accommodating these changes without immediate difficulty. But over time, the scale of this growth began to exceed the pace at which resources could be extended. Land remained finite. Opportunities did not expand at the same rate, and the balance between what was available and what was needed began to shift. This change did not happen suddenly. It unfolded gradually, across regions, across generations, and for a time it remained manageable. Communities adapted as they always had, adjusting practices, sharing resources, and finding ways to maintain stability within changing conditions. But adaptation required effort, and over time that effort increased. In rural areas, where most people depended directly on the land, this shift became more noticeable. Plots of land were divided among families, then divided again, and over time, what had once been sufficient became less so, where each generation worked within smaller margins, and where the outcome of each harvest carried greater significance than before. This did not immediately create crisis. Life continued. Fields were still cultivated. Families still gathered. And the rhythms of the seasons remained unchanged. But beneath these routines, the relationship between population and resource had begun to tighten. Not breaking, but narrowing. At the same time, movement between regions increased, as individuals and families sought opportunities beyond their immediate surroundings, creating patterns of migration that introduced new dynamics into areas that had previously remained more stable. These movements brought connection, but also complexity, where populations became less fixed, and local systems were required to adapt to changing conditions that were not always predictable. Within the administration, this growth presented a different kind of challenge. Governance had long depended on the ability to maintain balance between population and resource, where taxation, labor, and distribution required a degree of consistency to function effectively. But as population increased, maintaining that balance required greater precision, more coordination, and more adjustment than before. For now, the system continued to function. Officials recorded, organized, and responded to conditions as they arose, but the margin for error had become smaller, where slight variations could now carry wider consequences, and where maintaining stability required not only structure, but careful attention to conditions that were becoming increasingly complex. This was not yet a crisis, but it was a shift, where the scale of the population began to influence the behavior of the system itself, shaping how resources were used, how decisions were made, and how stability was maintained. For those living within the empire, these changes were often experienced not as a single transformation, but as a gradual increase in effort, more work required, less room for uncertainty, and a growing awareness that stability depended on conditions that were no longer as easily sustained. Still, the empire endured. Its systems remained in place, and its ability to function, though more demanding, continued. But the balance between population and resource had begun to change in ways that could not easily be reversed. And as the years passed, this imbalance would begin to interact with other pressures already present within the system, creating conditions that would be more difficult to manage than any single factor alone. Not immediately, not dramatically, but steadily, as the weight of numbers continued to shape the limits of what the empire could sustain, as the pressure created by population growth continued to shape the balance of the Qing Empire. The structures responsible for maintaining order were required to respond with increasing precision, and over time, this demand began to reveal another layer of change, one that emerged not from the system itself, but from how it was carried out by those within it. For many years, governance had depended on consistency, on the ability of officials to interpret, apply, and maintain policies across regions that differed in condition but remained connected through a shared structure. At first, this consistency held, the system functioned, records were maintained, obligations were met, and the connection between central authority and local practice remained largely intact. For now, this was enough. But as the demands on the system increased, so too did the opportunities for variation in how it was implemented. Not all regions faced the same conditions. Not all officials operated with the same capacity, and not all decisions were applied with the same degree of balance. This variation did not immediately disrupt the system, but it began to alter how it functioned. In subtle ways, across distance, across time. Within the administration, responsibilities grew more complex. Tasks required greater attention, decisions required more interpretation, and the gap between directive and execution became more dependent on individual judgment. For many officials, this meant navigating conditions that were not always aligned with expectation, where maintaining order required not only adherence to policy, but adaptation to circumstance. At first, such adaptation was necessary, even beneficial. It allowed the system to function across diversity, to remain flexible where rigidity would have failed. But over time, the space created by this flexibility also allowed for imbalance, where differences in interpretation became differences in outcome, and where the consistency that had once supported stability became more difficult to maintain. This was not yet corruption in the sense of widespread breakdown, but it was the beginning of something, a gradual bending of the system, where the line between adaptation and deviation became less clear. In some regions, officials continued to operate with care, maintaining balance and consistency despite increasing pressure. In others, the growing complexity of governance created conditions where personal judgment carried greater influence, and where decisions, shaped by local circumstance, began to diverge from central intention. For those living within the empire, these differences were not always visible as a single pattern. They were experienced as variations in how obligations were enforced, so in how resources were distributed, and in how authority was expressed at the local level. At first, these variations could be absorbed. Communities adjusted, as they always had. But over time, the accumulation of these differences began to shape perception, where consistency gave way to uncertainty, and where the reliability of the system, though still present, was no longer uniform. Within the broader structure, this introduced a new kind of pressure, not only on resources, but on trust, where the effectiveness of governance depended not only on policy, but on the degree to which that policy was applied in ways that aligned across regions. For now, this alignment remained largely intact. The system continued to function, and its authority remained recognized. But the nature of that authority had begun to change. It was no longer supported solely by structure. It depended increasingly on the actions of individuals within the system, and individuals, unlike structures, could vary. Over time, this variation would begin to matter more, as the conditions that allowed for flexibility also created space for imbalance, not suddenly, not dramatically, but gradually, as the system, still strong, began to bend under the combined weight of complexity, population pressure, and the increasing demands placed upon those responsible for maintaining it. And in the years that followed, this bending would become more visible as the differences that had once been contained began to interact with other pressures already present, shaping a new phase in which the stability of the empire would depend not only on its structure, but on how well that structure could be maintained under conditions that were no longer as easily controlled. As the Qing Empire continued to manage the growing pressures within its system, the changes that had long remained within administration and structure began, gradually, to appear in another form, not through policy or coordination, but through the responses of the people themselves. For a long time, the relationship between the population and the state had been defined by continuity. Obligations were understood, expectations were familiar, and the structures that connected daily life to governance, though distant, remained consistent enough to maintain a sense of order. But over time, as pressure increased, this relationship began to shift, not everywhere at once, not in a way that could be easily measured, but in quiet signs, in regions where land was limited, where resources were stretched, and where the effort required to maintain stability had grown beyond what could be easily sustained. At first, these changes appeared as small disturbances, localized, contained, difficult to distinguish from the normal variations of life across a vast empire. Groups gathered, concerns were shared, and in some places informal networks began to form, shaped by shared experience and the need to respond to conditions that felt increasingly uncertain. These gatherings were not yet organized movements, nor were they defined by clear objectives. They were expressions of adjustment, of communities seeking ways to manage pressures that could no longer be absorbed as easily as before. For now, this remained within the margins of the system. Life continued. Fields were cultivated, markets functioned, and the broader structure of the empire still held. But beneath that structure, a different kind of movement had begun, one that did not originate from authority, but from response. Over time, these responses became more connected. Ideas moved between regions, stories were shared, and what had once been isolated experiences began to take on a sense of common pattern. In some areas, this led to the formation of organized groups, often rooted in belief, tradition, or shared interpretation of the world, where individuals found not only explanation, but also a sense of direction within conditions that had become more difficult to navigate. Among these, movements such as the White Lotus began to appear, not as a single unified force at first, but as a collection of beliefs and communities that, over time, developed a more defined presence. These movements did not begin with the intention of direct confrontation. They emerged as responses, as ways of understanding and coping with a changing environment. But as their presence grew, and as the conditions that gave rise to them continued, they began to take on a different character, more structured, more connected, and more capable of influencing the broader system. For those within the administration, these developments were initially difficult to interpret. They did not fit easily into existing categories. They were not external threats, nor were they entirely internal. They existed within the space between, where pressure within the system began to express itself through the actions of those living under it. At first, responses were measured, localized, focused on containment rather than transformation. Officials addressed disturbances as they arose, attempting to restore order within the framework that had long supported stability. For a time, this approach was sufficient. The system absorbed these movements, as it had absorbed other pressures, and the overall structure remained intact. But over time, the persistence of these responses began to reveal something deeper, that the pressures shaping them were not temporary, nor isolated, but part of a broader shift in the relationship between the system and those within it. This was not yet widespread unrest, nor was it a clear challenge to authority, but it marked a transition, where the effects of pressure began to move beyond administration and into the fabric of daily life. For those experiencing it, this change was not always defined in clear terms. It was felt in uncertainty, in adjustment, and in the gradual recognition that stability, though still present, required more than it once had. Still, the empire endured, its structures remained, its authority continued, and from a distance it still appeared stable, but beneath that appearance, a new dynamic had begun, one that would, over time, connect with other pressures already present within the system. And in the years that followed, these movements, once subtle, would begin to take on greater form, as the balance between control and response became more difficult to maintain. Not all at once, not everywhere, but steadily. As the voices that had once remained at the edges began, gradually, to be heard more clearly. As the Qing Empire continued to respond to pressures within its own structure, another change was beginning to unfold beyond its borders, one that would gradually bring the outside world closer in ways that had not been experienced before. For much of its history, the empire had operated with a sense of internal completeness, where its systems, resources, and traditions formed a world that did not depend heavily on external influence. Trade existed, connections were maintained, but they were managed within frameworks that preserved balance and control. For now, this distance remained. Yet, over time, the patterns of global movement began to shift. Maritime trade expanded, routes connected distant regions more directly, and the presence of foreign merchants along China's southern coasts became more frequent and more consistent. At first, these interactions remained limited, regulated through established systems that controlled where and how trade could occur, ensuring that exchange took place within boundaries that maintained stability. Goods moved in measured quantities. Silver flowed into the economy, and the system, though influenced, remained largely intact. But as demand increased, and as trade networks expanded, the nature of this exchange began to change. Not suddenly, but gradually, in ways that introduced new dynamics into a system that had long relied on careful balance. Among the goods that moved along these routes was opium, a substance that at first appeared within the margins of trade, limited in scale and influence, and not yet recognized as a factor that could alter the broader structure of the empire. For now, its presence was small, almost incidental, but over time, its role began to grow, not through official channels, but through networks that operated alongside them, quietly, persistently. As demand increased, the flow of opium expanded, and with it, a new kind of imbalance began to take shape. Silver, which had once flowed steadily into the empire, began to move outward in exchange for a substance that did not contribute to production, but instead altered patterns of consumption and dependency. This shift was not immediately visible at the level of daily life. For many, routines continued. Fields were cultivated, markets functioned, and the rhythms of society remained intact. But beneath these patterns, the economic balance that had supported stability began to change, gradually, almost imperceptibly. Within the administration, awareness of this shift emerged slowly. Officials observed changes in trade patterns, in the movement of silver, and in the effects of opium use within certain regions. At first, responses were cautious, measured, focused on regulation rather than disruption. Policies were introduced, restrictions attempted. But the nature of the networks involved made enforcement uneven, where control depended on coordination across regions that were not always aligned. This did not yet represent a loss of control, but it introduced a new kind of challenge, one that did not originate from within the system, but interacted with it in ways that were difficult to manage using existing structures. At the same time, the presence of foreign traders brought with it different expectations, different approaches to exchange, and different understandings of how trade should function, creating a point of contact between systems that did not always align. For a time, this difference remained manageable. The empire continued to operate within its own framework, and the external presence, though increasing, did not immediately alter its core structure. But the distance between these two worlds was narrowing, not only physically, but economically and structurally. As the flow of goods, resources, and influence became more interconnected, For those living within the empire, these changes were often experienced indirectly, through shifts in availability, in pricing, in conditions that felt slightly different, though not yet clearly defined. Life continued, as it always had, and the sense of continuity remained strong. But the system that supported that continuity was now interacting with forces beyond its original design. For now, this interaction remained within manageable limits. The empire endured, its structures held, and its authority continued. Yet the nature of that authority was beginning to encounter conditions that required a different kind of response, not only to internal pressure, but to external influence. And in the years that followed, this interaction would deepen as the balance between internal stability and external demand became more difficult to maintain, leading the empire into a new phase where the boundaries that had once defined it would begin to shift. Not suddenly, not all at once, but in ways that would gradually reshape how the system understood its place within a changing world. As the Qing Empire continued to navigate the growing presence of external influence, the balance that had once allowed trade to remain controlled and contained began, gradually, to give way to a different kind of interaction, one that could no longer be managed within the same familiar structures. For a long time, the empire had approached external trade through regulation, defining where it could occur, how it would be conducted, and under what conditions it would be allowed to continue. This system had maintained a sense of order, allowing exchange without significantly altering the internal balance of the empire. But over time, the forces shaping that exchange began to change. Demand increased, networks expanded, and the flow of goods, particularly opium, moved beyond the limits that regulation alone could effectively control. Within the administration, awareness of this shift had already begun to take form. Concerns were raised, measures were proposed, and efforts were made to restore balance by limiting the movement of opium and reasserting control over trade. Among those tasked with this responsibility was Lin Zexu, an official whose approach reflected both the seriousness of the situation and the belief that the system could still be guided back towards stability through decisive action. At first, these actions were directed inward, focused on enforcement, on reducing the presence of opium within the empire, and on re-establishing the authority of regulation over networks that had begun to operate beyond its reach. For a time, this effort appeared to bring clarity. Control was asserted, opium was confiscated, and the intention to restore balance was made visible, but the system was no longer operating within a single framework. The external forces involved did not respond in the same way as internal structures. They operated under different expectations, different assumptions, and different definitions of authority. And it was within this difference that conflict began to take shape, not as a sudden break, but as a widening gap between two systems that no longer aligned. For the Qing Empire, the issue was one of control, of restoring balance within its own structure. For the foreign traders, it was a matter of access, of maintaining and expanding exchange according to their own terms. These perspectives did not easily reconcile, and over time the space between them grew. What had once been managed through negotiation and regulation now required a different response, and in that transition, conflict emerged. This conflict did not resemble those that had occurred along the northern frontier. It was not shaped by the same patterns, nor did it unfold within the same expectations. It involved new forms of movement, new forms of engagement, and a scale of interaction that extended beyond the boundaries the empire had long maintained. At first, the effects were localized, limited to specific regions, focused on points of contact where these differences became most apparent. But even within these limits, the nature of the interaction began to shift, from negotiation to resistance, from regulation to confrontation. For those living within the empire, these developments were not always immediately understood. Life continued, fields were cultivated, markets functioned, and the rhythms of daily existence remained largely unchanged. But beneath these routines, the system that supported them had entered a new phase, one in which the conditions of stability were no longer determined solely from within. Within the administration, responses were shaped by the need to maintain authority, to restore balance, and to address a situation that did not conform to existing models. Efforts were made, strategies adjusted, and actions taken with the intention of re-establishing control. Yet, the nature of the challenge made this increasingly difficult. The system, designed to manage internal complexity, was now interacting with external forces that required a different kind of response, one that could not easily be integrated into the structures that had long defined governance. For now, the empire endured. Its institutions remained, its authority continued, but the conditions under which that authority operated had changed, and the conflict that had begun to take shape would, over time, reveal the extent to which the system could adapt to a world that was no longer contained within its own boundaries. Not immediately, not all at once, but through a series of events that would gradually reshape the balance between internal order and external influence. And in the years that followed, this new form of conflict would begin to leave a more visible mark, as the outcomes of these encounters would extend beyond the points at which they began, altering not only trade, but the structure of the system itself. In the years that followed the first stages of conflict between the Qing Empire and the external forces pressing against it, the outcomes of these encounters began to take on a more defined shape, not only in the form of immediate events, but in the longer-lasting adjustments that followed them. At first, these outcomes were understood as resolutions, agreements intended to restore balance, to define terms, and to allow interaction to continue without further disruption. For a time, this appeared possible. The structures of governance remained in place. The empire continued to function, and the sense of continuity, though altered, had not yet been broken. But the nature of these agreements was different from those that had come before. They were not shaped entirely within the framework of the Qing system, nor were they fully aligned with its expectations. Instead, they reflected a shift in how authority was expressed within these interactions, where the terms of exchange, access, and control were no longer determined by a single system alone. This difference was not always immediately visible in daily life. Markets continued, fields were cultivated, and the routines that defined ordinary existence remained largely unchanged. But beneath these routines, the structure that connected them to the broader system had begun to adjust in ways that carried long-term consequences. Ports that had once been tightly regulated began to open more widely. Trade, once carefully contained, expanded beyond its earlier boundaries, and the presence of external actors within the empire's economic and social landscape became more consistent. For now, these changes were manageable. They did not immediately disrupt the internal structure of the empire, but they altered the conditions under which that structure operated. Control, once clearly defined, became more distributed, not lost entirely, but shared in ways that were not always aligned with the system's original design. Within the administration, this required adjustment. Policies were revised, practices adapted, and efforts were made to integrate these new conditions into existing frameworks. For a time, this approach allowed the system to continue functioning. The empire endured, its authority remained, and its structures, though altered, still held. Yet the nature of that authority had begun to change. It was no longer exercised within a closed system. It now operated within a broader context, where external influence could shape outcomes in ways that were not always predictable. For those living within the empire, these changes were often experienced indirectly, through the availability of goods, through shifts in trade, and through the gradual presence of new conditions that felt different, though not always clearly understood. Life continued, as it always had, and the rhythms of daily existence remained steady. But the system that supported those rhythms was no longer entirely self-contained. It had become part of a larger network, one in which control was more complex, and where the boundaries that had once defined the empire were less clearly maintained. This was not yet a loss of control in the sense of collapse, but it was a transition, where control became more difficult to sustain in its original form, and where the effort required to maintain balance now depended not only on internal coordination, but on interaction with forces beyond the system itself. Over time, this distinction would begin to matter more, as the accumulation of these adjustments altered how the empire functioned, not by removing its structures, but by changing the conditions under which those structures operated. For now, the empire remained, its presence still strong, its system still active, but the nature of its control had begun to shift. And in the years that followed, this shift would become more visible, as the balance between internal authority and external influence continued to evolve, shaping a phase in which maintaining stability would require more than the system alone could provide. Not suddenly, not all at once, but gradually, as the boundaries that once defined control became increasingly difficult to hold in the same way. As the Qing Empire continued to adjust to the shifting balance between internal structure and external influence, the pressures that had been building across its system began, gradually, to converge in a way that could no longer remain contained, giving rise to a form of disruption that extended beyond administration and into the core of society itself. For many years, the empire had managed the strain through adaptation, through adjustment, and through the continued functioning of institutions that allowed balance to be maintained, even under increasing demand. But over time, the accumulation of pressures, from population growth to administrative variation and external influence, created conditions in which stability became more difficult to sustain across all regions at once. At first, this difficulty appeared uneven. Some areas remained stable, others required greater attention, and the system, though stretched, continued to function. For now, it held. But beneath this uneven balance, new forms of response were beginning to take shape. Not only as localized unrest, but as movements that connected belief, experience, and shared conditions into something more structured. Among these, the Taiping movement emerged, not immediately as a unified force, but as a developing response to the conditions that had been forming over time, where individuals sought not only explanation, but transformation. At its center was Hongshuquan, whose interpretation of belief and order provided a framework through which existing conditions could be understood differently, and through which the possibility of change could be imagined in ways that extended beyond the limits of the current system. At first, this movement grew quietly, drawing together communities that shared similar experiences, forming connections that were not yet fully visible, and developing a structure that, over time, would begin to expand. For now, this growth remained at the edges. The empire continued, its institutions still functioned, and the broader structure of authority remained in place. But the conditions that supported that structure had begun to shift. As the Taiping movement expanded, it did so not only through numbers, but through alignment, where belief, purpose, and shared experience created a form of cohesion that allowed it to grow beyond isolated regions. This was no longer only unrest, it was organization, and organization, once established, could extend itself in ways that were more difficult to contain. Within the administration, the response to this development was shaped by the need to restore order, yet the scale and nature of the movement made this increasingly complex. It was not confined to a single location, nor was it limited to a single cause. It was the result of multiple pressures interacting, and as such, it required more than localized response. For those living within affected regions, the change was more immediate. Routes became uncertain, communities were disrupted, and the rhythms of daily life, once steady, were altered by conditions that could no longer be managed within familiar patterns. And yet, even within this disruption, the broader structure of the empire remained. The system had not yet collapsed. Its authority still existed, and efforts to restore balance continued. But the nature of the challenge had changed. It was no longer only about maintaining control. It was about responding to a movement that had grown from within the system itself, one that reflected not a single cause, but the convergence of many. Over time, this convergence began to reshape the relationship between center and periphery, where the ability of the central authority to maintain consistent control across all regions became more limited, not entirely lost, but uneven, dependent on conditions that varied across the empire. This did not yet mark the end, but it marked a transition, where the system, still present, could no longer operate with the same degree of cohesion it once had, and where the effort required to restore balance now extended beyond the capacity of any single response. For now, the empire endured. Its structures remained. Its authority continued. But the center, though still intact, was no longer able to hold all parts of the system with the same consistency. And, in the years that followed, this shift would become more visible as the effects of internal disruption continued to interact with the pressures already present, shaping a phase in which the question was no longer whether change would occur, but how far it would extend, and how much of the existing structure it would leave unchanged. As the Qing Empire moved further into a state of fragmentation, the structures that had once defined its strength remained visible. Yet the conditions required to sustain those structures had begun to fall out of alignment in ways that could no longer be easily restored. For a long time, the empire had endured through adaptation, through adjustment, and through the ability to absorb pressure without allowing it to disrupt the overall form of the system. But over time, as internal strain, external influence, and social unrest continued to interact, the balance that had once supported this resilience became increasingly difficult to maintain. At first, this imbalance appeared as variation, differences between regions, differences in administration, differences in experience. But now, these differences had begun to converge, creating conditions in which the system could no longer operate as a unified whole, even if its form still suggested that it did. For now, the empire remained. Its name continued. Its institutions still functioned. And from a distance, it retained the appearance of continuity. But within that appearance, the capacity to maintain coherence across its vast structure had weakened, not suddenly, not completely, but in ways that could now be felt more clearly than before. In some regions, authority persisted. In others, it depended on local conditions. And in many, it existed somewhere in between. This was not collapse in a single moment, but the gradual loss of the conditions that had once made stability possible. And, as this process continued, the effort required to sustain the system no longer produced the same results. More effort, less alignment, more coordination, less consistency. Until the structure, though still present, could no longer be sustained in the way it once had been. It is here, in this quiet transition, that something becomes clear, not as a dramatic realization, but as a simple observation that systems do not only fail when they break, they also change when they can no longer maintain the balance that once allowed them to function with ease. And as I reflect on this moment, there is something calm in the way this transformation unfolds. It does not rush. It does not announce itself. It simply continues, guided by the conditions that shape it. And in doing so, it reminds us that stability is not a fixed state. It is a relationship between structure and condition, between expectation and reality. And when that relationship changes, even slightly, the system itself begins to change with it. For those who lived within the empire, this was not always something that could be clearly understood. Life continued, as it always does, within routines that still provided a sense of familiarity. And yet, beneath those routines, the system that supported them had begun to move beyond its previous limits, not collapsing, but no longer able to sustain itself in the same form. There is a quiet lesson in this, one that does not belong only to this moment, but to all systems that grow, expand, and seek to maintain balance over time. That strength is not only found in structure, but in the ability to adapt without losing alignment. And that when adaptation becomes more difficult than maintenance can support, change becomes inevitable, not as failure, but as transition. And in the years that followed, this transition would continue, carrying the empire toward a point where its form, though still present, would no longer define its reality, and where what remained would begin to give way to something new. Not suddenly, not all at once, but gradually, as the shape that had once held everything together could no longer be sustained in quite the same way. In the years that followed the gradual unraveling of cohesion within the Qing Empire, the structures that had once defined its presence continued to exist, yet their meaning had begun to shift, as what had once been a system of balance and coordination slowly became something else. Not entirely gone, but no longer what it had been. For a long time, the empire had been sustained not only by its institutions, but by the relationship between those institutions and the conditions that allowed them to function. And as those conditions changed, the system itself had adapted, adjusted, endured. But now, that process of adaptation had reached a point where maintaining the same form required more than the system could provide. At first, this did not appear as an ending. Life continued, as it always does. Fields were cultivated, markets opened and closed, families gathered within the rhythms that had long shaped daily existence. And yet, beneath these familiar patterns, the larger structure that had once connected them all had begun to loosen in ways that could no longer be fully restored. Authority, though still present, was no longer experienced in the same way. Where once it had flowed with consistency, it now moved unevenly. Where once it had provided clarity, it now required interpretation. And where once it had defined the system, it now existed within conditions that shaped it from outside as much as from within. This was not collapse in the sense of sudden disappearance, but transformation, a quiet transition from one state to another, where continuity remained in appearance, but meaning had begun to change. For those living within this world, the experience was not always defined by a single moment of realization. It unfolded gradually, across time, across generations, as the structures that had once seemed permanent became part of a changing landscape where the past remained visible, even as the present moved beyond it. And as I reflect on this final phase, there is something steady in the way it unfolds. A reminder that systems, no matter how vast, are shaped not only by their strength, but by their ability to remain aligned with the conditions around them. And when that alignment shifts, even slowly, the system begins to change with it, not as failure, but as part of a larger pattern, where beginnings carry within them the conditions of their own transformation. And endings are not always marked by disappearance, but by the gradual movement into something else. There is a quiet lesson here, one that extends beyond this moment. That stability, when it lasts, often feels natural, effortless, as if it could continue indefinitely. But in truth, it is always the result of balance, maintained, adjusted, sustained over time. And when that balance becomes more difficult to hold, the change that follows is not sudden. It is gradual, unfolding in ways that are not always immediately visible, but no less real. For now, the empire still exists within this moment, its form still present, its history still visible, but its role has begun to shift, from a system that defines the present to one that becomes part of the past, and in that shift, something changes, not only in structure, but in meaning. As what once held everything together becomes something that can be remembered, studied, and understood, not as something that simply ended, but as something that changed, gradually, inevitably, into something else. And as this transition continues, the rhythm of life carries on, as it always does, moving forward, even as the shape of the world behind it slowly fades into memory. And now, there is nothing more to follow, no more structures to hold, no more systems to trace, no more timelines to move forward through, only the quiet space that remains after everything has already unfolded. And in this space, there is no need to think about what came before. No need to hold on to names or places or events. They can drift gently, as all things do over time, like distant echoes that soften and slowly fade. You are here now, in this moment, with nothing required and nowhere to go. The story has settled, and what remains is only a sense of stillness, a calm presence that asks nothing of you. You may notice your breath, the way it rises and falls without effort, without direction, just as it has always done, quietly, steadily. You do not need to change it. Only notice as it moves in its own time. And as you rest here, there is no need to follow every thought. If something appears, you can let it pass, like clouds, moving across a wide and open sky. There is no need to hold them, no need to understand them. They will move on, as all things do. And as they do, the space between them grows wider, softer, more still. Your body can begin to settle, releasing what it has been holding, even without realizing it. Your shoulders can rest, your face can soften, your breathing can slow. Not because you are trying, but because there is nothing left to carry. The world around you can become quieter, not silent, but distant, as if it is slowly stepping back, giving you space to rest. And in this space, there is no past, no future, only this gentle moment, stretching softly into stillness. If your mind wanders, that is all right. It can wander and return as it wishes. There is nothing to follow now, nothing to keep track of, only the rhythm of rest, of breath, of quiet. And as you continue to settle, you may begin to feel how natural it is to let go, not all at once, but gradually, as tension loosens and thought becomes lighter and softer, until even the awareness of listening begins to fade. And the story, which once moved across time and place and change, becomes something distant, something quiet, something that no longer needs to be held. Only the calm remains, only the steady rhythm of breath, of rest, of stillness. And in this stillness, sleep can arrive, gently, without effort, without intention. just as all things have arrived throughout the night. Gradually, quietly, naturally. And as you drift, there is nothing more to do, nothing more to follow, only rest. Only calm, only the quiet that has always been here, waiting softly for you to arrive.